Well, thank you, Andrew, for that introduction. Is my phone going? It's a wonderful start, isn't it? Okay, good evening. I'm talking tonight about German cinema and its importance from just before the outbreak of the First World War to the mid-1930s. And the first thing that's interesting to note is that German cinema had an enormous influence on American cinema, on Hollywood, from the very beginning. Two of the big studios in Hollywood, Universal and Fox, were founded by Germans. It's interesting to me that given the extraordinary explosion of art, architecture in Vienna around the turn of the century, that almost no films were made in Vienna in the years that followed. Everything happened in Berlin. Cinema in Germany flourished from the very beginning of cinema, from the turn of the century. Though in the period prior to World War I, most of the films screened in German cinemas came from Sweden or Denmark. German films of this pre-war period were already focusing on themes of fantasy and horror. Stellan Rye, a Danish director, made a film called The Student of Prague in 1913, which is based on a story by Edgar Allan Poe, and which is a Faustian story in which a man sells his soul to the devil. But on the other hand, Ernst Lubitsch, who started directing films in 1914, made Jewish comedies. Lubitsch was the son of a tailor. He joined Max Reinhardt's very influential Deutsches Theater in 1911 as an actor, but soon quit the stage to make a series of simple slapstick films, often starring himself as a character he called Pincus. He made dozens of these films during the war. In 1918, Lubitsch made a horror film, The Eyes of the Mummy. And after that, he became famous for his spectacular historical films. Madame du Barry, made in 1919, Anne Boleyn and Sumerum, made the following year. And it was because of films like that, like those, that Lubitsch was headhunted, to use a modern expression, by Mary Pickford, who at the time was the most powerful woman in cinema in America, who imported him to Hollywood in 1923 to direct her in a film called Rosita. So Lubitsch's reputation was such that Hollywood seized him. And thus he became the first of the Germans to emigrate to Hollywood, where he quickly established himself as a great director of comedies and musicals, and in the mid-30s became head of production at Paramount. Joe May was another important director of German silent films. He was born in Vienna, but he moved to Berlin after directing operettas in Hamburg. He specialized in thrillers and fantastic adventures, and in 1917, he gave a young writer called Fritz Lang his first job in the film industry as a writer. Joe May's most famous films are the two-part adventure The Indian Tomb, made in 1921 and scripted by Fritz Lang and his second wife, Thea von Harbow, and Asphalt, made in 1929, a grim drama about a woman thief and a policeman, which was staged on impressive studio-constructed city sets. Joe May wound up making B pictures in Hollywood. He never found success in America. The most influential film made in Germany during this period was unquestionably The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. This was the ultimate expressionist film. The director was Robert Wiener, and this haunting story of the hallucinations of a madman employed stylized acting and sets in which artificial shadows emphasized the strange distortions. It's perhaps the first example of film as art. Most films at the time were based on plays or novels, but The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari was an original screenplay by Hans Janowitz and Karl Mayer, and was inspired by a real-life series of unsolved murders. To give the film its look, the Expressionist artists Hermann Warm, Walter Ruhrig, and Walter Reimann were hired to design the sets. Distorted perspectives, twisted shapes, sharp angles, a conscious avoidance of verticals and horizontals, both interior and exterior. And not just the sets, but the costumes, the furniture, even the style of acting were in keeping with the Expressionist movement. Most films at this time attempted to look realistic. Caligari set out to look as alien and unreal as possible. The new art spread across Europe, and the film brought German cinema to preeminence. I said that it was made in 1919. You might read some history books that give different dates. It was actually released in Berlin at the end of 1919, but widely in 1920. And when you see it dated in 1921, you know that's an American book because that was the year it opened in America. The biggest beneficiary of the film was probably the actor Conrad Veidt, who played the somnambulist in the movie. The director, Robert Wiener, followed Caligari with a vampire film, but his career never really took off. In the wake of Caligari, horror films became popular in Germany. Paul Wegener made The Golem in 1920, in which a monster turns men to stone. And F.W. Murnau made Nosferatu, an unofficial version of Bram Stoker's Dracula, in 1922. More about Murnau in a moment. In the meantime, Joe May's protege, Fritz Lang, is worth discussing. Fritz Lang was born in Vienna in 1890, the son of an architect. As a teenager, he traveled widely, and during the war, as a soldier in the Austrian army, he was wounded 3 times. After the war, he arrived in Berlin and was hired as a writer for the producer Erich Pommer. Soon he was directing serials like The Spiders, and then feature films like The Quiet Death, known outside Germany as Destiny, and made in 1919, a film that foreshadows Ingmar Bergman's The Seventh Seal because it makes death a rational being. Fritz Lang subsequently made Dr. Mabuse the Gambler in 1922, a 2-part thriller about a master criminal, and the Nibelungen Saga, also in 2 parts, made in 1924, a huge success throughout Europe in its depiction of Germanic legends, the stories of Siegfried and Brunhilde. And this was followed in 1927 by the most famous of German silent films, Metropolis, which is, I believe, screening here later this evening, an extraordinary piece of science fiction about a city of the future and the way the rulers of the city control the lives of its workers. With the coming of sound, Lang made M, an extraordinary thriller about a serial killer starring a Hungarian-born actor called Peter Lorre. And then The Testament of Dr. Mabuse, a sequel to his silent film about the master criminal. The Nazis came to power at the beginning of 1933, and Lang was invited to come to the office of the new head of media, communication and cinema, Goebbels. Goebbels told him that Hitler had very much admired Metropolis and also the Nibelungen Saga, and would like Lang to take control of the new German film industry under the Nazis. He also told him that the Nazi Party had decided to ban The Testament of Dr. Mabuse because the character of the madman in the film was seen to be spouting the same sort of dialogue that Hitler was spouting. Lang, if you believe his own account of the matter, went home, packed his bag, and headed off for France that night. It's not quite true, but it's a good story. In France, he made one film called Lilium, and then he wound up in America, where his first film, made in 1936, Fury, was an indictment of the lynch mob mentality. And Lang, like many of the German directors, became an important director of genre films in America, including the genre that became known as film noir, thrillers with a very Germanic, expressionistic look. Lang actually had been asked to direct The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, but he was so busy with other projects that he passed it by. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that F.W. Murnau made the unofficial version of Bram Stoker's Dracula Nosferatu in 1922. Murnau was born in 1888 near Heidelberg. And next to Lubitsch and Fritz Lang, he was the most influential director to emerge from Germany. His eerie version of Dracula was followed in 1925 by a film called The Last Man, known in English as The Last Laugh, in which the great actor Emil Jannings played a man who has for many years been the front man at a very smart hotel in Berlin, the doorman, the one who greets the guests as they arrive, but who is cruelly and unfeelingly demoted to the job of toilet attendant. The film was remarkable because as a silent film, and silent films used to largely tell the story through intertitles, this film had no intertitles at all. The story was told entirely visually. And that was immediately of interest to the people in Hollywood. Murnau went on to make versions of Faust and Tartuffe, both of them starring Emil Jannings, and then both of them were brought to Hollywood, where Jannings appeared in films directed by Lubitsch and by Joseph von Sternberg, a Viennese-born Hollywood director, and Jannings won an Oscar for Best Actor in 1927. Murnau, meanwhile, was given carte blanche by William Fox, the German-born founder of Fox Films, to make Sunrise, the most Germanic of American silent films, and a film that had a huge influence on American directors such as John Ford and Frank Borzage. But that was 1927, and sadly 1927 was the year of the jazz singer. And Murnau, like many silent film directors, was unprepared for the talkie revolution. His next film was shelved and recut, after which he made a documentary, Taboo, and he was killed in a car accident in 1931 at the age of only 43. During this period, there were very close links between the German and British cinema, and a young English title writer called Alfred Hitchcock came to Germany in the mid-1920s to work on a couple of co-productions. Hitchcock's first two feature films were made in Germany, and throughout his career he was influenced by German Expressionism, as you can clearly see if you look at most of his films. Another German director of importance is G.W. Pabst, who was born in 1885 in what was then Bohemia and is now part of the Czech Republic. In his youth he traveled widely. He became an important Berlin director with a very downbeat film called The Joyless Street in 1925, which reflected the poverty of many Germans between the wars during the period of hyperinflation and depression, and which offered a starring role to a young Swedish actress called Greta Garbo. Pabst was a realist, unlike some of the others. His films were frequently very grim. Pandora's Box and Diary of a Lost Girl followed in 1929, both starring the talented American actress Louise Brooks. With the coming of sound, Pabst made Westfront 1918, a powerful anti-war film, Kameradschaft or Comradeship, a film that makes a plea for international friendship and cooperation, and The Threepenny Opera, a marvelous adaptation of the Bertolt Brecht-Kurtweil operetta. With the coming to power of the Nazis, Pabst left Germany and made one film in Hollywood, A Modern Hero, in 1934, which was not a success, and then relocated to France, where he made a couple of films, and then returned to Germany. In 1929, a group of young filmmakers in Berlin, 4 of them, Robert Siodmak, Billy Wilder, Fred Zinnemann, and Edgar G. Ulmer, made a semi-documentary called People on Sunday, which is a wonderful look at Berliners enjoying a sunny Sunday afternoon. All 4 of these filmmakers wound up in Hollywood. But before that, Robert Siodmak made one of the best early German sound films, Abschied, or Farewell, about a group of people living in a rundown boarding house. And he followed this with Preliminary Investigation, a tense thriller. Later in Hollywood, working at Universal, the studio founded by Carl Laemmle, a German, Robert Siodmak became famous for his thrillers, The Killers, The Dark Mirror, The Spiral Staircase, Crisscross, and others. Billy Wilder, of course, eventually also went to America, where he made films like Some Like It Hot and Double Indemnity and The Apartment. And Fred Zinnemann, also, who made films like From Here to Eternity and Oklahoma and A Man for All Seasons. And Edgar G. Ulmer, who made not such interesting films. But what would Hollywood have been without these German filmmakers? The other major early sound film produced in Germany was The Blue Angel, which was directed by the Viennese-American Joseph von Sternberg, who came to Berlin to make the film and who allegedly discovered Marlene Dietrich for the role of Lola Lola, the singer who seduces a naive schoolteacher played by Emil Jannings. Jannings had returned to Germany after the coming of sound because his English was never very good. Sternberg didn't really discover Dietrich. She had been in a couple of films prior to The Blue Angel, but she, of course, gives an electric performance in the film. And what is interesting is that, like many early sound films, The Blue Angel was made in 2 versions. Sternberg made a German version, and he also made an English version. And if you look at both of them, they're slightly different. Dietrich, who spoke very good English, speaks English in the English version and German in the German version, and sings the songs in English in the English version, and so on. And many of the other actors also acted in both versions. But it's interesting to see the differences in bits of dialogue and the different takes, really, between the 2 versions. I should also perhaps mention another interesting early sound film made in 1931, a film version of the very grim novel Berlin Alexanderplatz, which was filmed much more successfully many, many years later by Rainer Werner Fassbinder. And we also mustn't forget the mountain films, very popular films about mountain climbing, which were huge box office successes in Germany. Films like The White Hell of Piz Palu, which was directed by Arnold Fanck and which starred the future Nazi documentary filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl. As we've seen, the Nazis came to power in January 1933, and the effect on the film industry was immediate. All Jews were expelled from the industry, and one of the first films made under the Nazis was a film called Hitler Youth Keks, which was the story of a boy whose father is a communist, but who is himself attracted to the Hitler Youth and to the Nazi Party. It was an enormous success in Germany during 1933 and 1934. The major director of the Nazi period was Veit Harlan, who was born in 1899 in Berlin. Like many of the filmmakers we've talked about, he worked with the great Jewish stage director Max Reinhardt before turning to film. Veit Harlan's early films, The Sovereign, made in 1937 with Emil Jannings, and like Sand in the Wind, a period mystery made in 1938, were non-political. But later on, with films like Juice Seuss, Owen Kruger and Kohlberg, his work became clearly anti-Semitic, and he was brought to trial after the war. Of course, not only German directors, but also actors found success in Hollywood, most notably Marlene Dietrich, but also character actors like Conrad Veidt, who can forget him in Casablanca, Peter Lorre, also in Casablanca, and a great many others. In fact, if it hadn't been for the input of European directors, and especially German directors, Hollywood would probably never have achieved the heights it did in the golden age of cinema. The German influence of Hollywood is quite remarkable. As for German cinema itself, it took a while to survive the war and the post-war division of the country. But by the 1970s, a new generation of German directors emerged to startle the world. But that's another story. That gives you, I hope, an overview of some of the most important developments in this very influential area of cinema in Germany during the period covered by this exhibition. I'm very happy to answer any questions, if anybody has any questions to ask me.
I just wondered how many of those directors and actors were actually Jewish?
Most of them. Could you all hear the question? Most of them were Jewish. Not all, but most of them were. And of course, it was it was an incredible, depending which way you look at it, of course. If you were a Nazi, you wouldn't look at it this way. But an amazing loss to the German cinema when suddenly all those Jewish directors and actors and writers and producers were forced to leave the industry in 1933. I mean, the most important producer in Germany, a man called Erich Pommer, who originally ran a company called Deckler, Bierskop, and later on Ufer, very famous German production company that made most of the films we've talked about. Erich Pommer was a Jew, and he also, of course, had to leave. So the German film industry was not destroyed, but severely affected by that decision. But of course, as far as the Nazis were concerned, that was fine. That's what they wanted. So a new breed of German filmmakers emerged. I think it's true to say that the films made under the Nazi period are of much less interest than the films made beforehand. But I don't want to be too categorical about it, because until recently it's been very hard to see the Nazi films for obvious reasons. And I've only in the last couple of years have I actually seen some of them, and they're interesting. I mean, they're pretty despicable, but they're interesting.
Since we're in an art gallery, I thought it'd be interesting to ask what the tie between the art movements and the cinematic sort of movements, like when you mention Expressionism, what the links are to, say, German Expressionism in terms of painting at the time, or modernism, you know, what the parallels are between them.
Look, I think there is always a certain link between cinema and the art world. I think filmmakers, and especially cinematographers, are influenced by what's happening in the world of art, or at least they certainly were then. Hence, Expressionism and how that became an important part of German cinema. But I think many German films and many American films, given that there's a German influence on American films, would be influenced by certain works of art, certain styles, certain lighting, the source of the light, and so on. So that is always an element, because the two art forms, obviously, they're both visual arts, so there's a link between them. Yeah?
You mentioned the UFA studios. Could you tell us a bit more about the importance of UFA and what they did?
UFA was by far the most important, or became by far the most important German production house during this period between the wars. And it was under the control of Erich Pommer. It was UFA that brought most of these directors and writers into the film industry and nurtured their careers and became one of the world's preeminent film studios. So it was a very important studio. Again, with the coming of the Nazis, it changed out of all recognition. But its headquarters, the headquarters of UFA in Berlin, is the old headquarters, which after the war became part of East Berlin. Today is still a center for film production in that city. So there's now new refurbished studios at Babelsberg, which is where UFA was originally based. And a lot of German films are produced there, and not only German films, but international films.
You mentioned in the film Caligari,
Yes.
which I think was around 1919.
Yes.
You said that the way it was shot avoided horizontal and vertical shots and went for angular because it was, I think you said because it was a product of the art movement of the time. Can you say a little bit more about that? What the idea of using angular shots was?
I think the thing about the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is, and I think there were two reasons why the film employed this expressionistic look and used these kinds of images that you're talking about. One was money. It was money, as you can imagine, in Germany in 1919 was in pretty short supply. So in order to create a film entirely in the studio, where even the exterior scenes, streets and so on, were painted sets, was obviously, first of all, going to save money. But the film is a story told by a madman, basically. So it's the product of a deranged mind. And so the look of the film was influenced by the theme of the film. So this idea of insanity and madness is evoked in the imagery, in the way the sets were painted, in the way in the perspectives, the sort of strange perspectives used, and as I said, even to the extent of the way the actors moved. I mean, Conrad Veidt in the film appears to glide through his scenes rather than actually walk. It's a very uncanny effect, and so those are the reasons that the film employed that. I mean, it's directly connected with the theme of the film, but it was so successful and so influential, and it was shown all over the world, that it did influence, not to the same extreme, but it did influence many, many other films, so that the use of shadows, the use of strange angles and perspectives became, in a certain type of film, quite common. Orson Welles was very influenced by the Expressionism in films like Caligari. Yes.
Leni Riefenstahl's The Triumph of the Will.
Yes, which I didn't mention, yes.
Yeah, I was wondering if you passed over it because it is politically reprehensible, but it was stylistically quite artful, and it is quite a triumph in cinema, would you say?
This is a question about a film I didn't mention, Triumph of the Will, which was a documentary made by Leni Riefenstahl. Leni Riefenstahl, as I said before, was an actress who had starred in many of these mountain films. She was very athletic, very beautiful. She was quite intrepid in some of the stunts and things that she did. She became a documentary filmmaker. She was very much favoured by the Nazi Party and by Hitler personally. And so she was commissioned to make the definitive film about the Nuremberg Rally in 1934, I think it was, from memory. And she made an extraordinary film. I mean, Triumph of the Will is a celebration of the Nazi Party, but there's no denying that it's a magnificent piece of cinema and was seen as such, I think, by many, even though because of what it's depicting, it was a film that was always going to be controversial. A couple of years later, she was commissioned to make the film of the 1936 Berlin Olympic Games, which again is a remarkable film, probably the best film ever made about Olympic Games, but again is very much a celebration of the Aryan style, the Aryan look, the Aryan man and woman as celebrated by the Nazis. So Riefenstahl is an interesting figure, but and undoubtedly a great filmmaker, but a bit dodgy. And that's all we have time for. I'm sorry.